Welcome back. It's time now for the France 24 debate. And today we have our eye firmly fixed on the Egyptian capital, where the foreign ministers of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt and Bahrain have been gathering to discuss next steps with regard to the continuing standoff with Qatar. Exactly 1 month ago today, those four Arab states broke off diplomatic and transport ties with Qatar, accusing the country, amongst other things, of aiding terrorism. Accusations the Qatari leadership firmly denies. Well, Doha was then given a set of 13 demands, amongst them the demand that they shut down the Al Jazeera news channel. And Qatar was told that if it met those demands, the blockade on the country would then be lifted. Well, the deadline for a response was Monday. An extension was then given, and that extension expired today, with Doha saying the demands are impossible to meet. Let's listen in now to the Qatari Foreign Minister, Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdul Rahman Al Thani, and what he had to say.
As the 48 hours extension is coming to an end, Qatar continues to call for dialogue despite the violations of international laws and regulation, despite the separation of 12,000 families, despite the siege that is a clear aggression and an insult to all international treaties, bodies and jurisdictions.
And that was the Qatari Foreign Minister. Let's listen in now to how the Egyptian Foreign Minister reacted to the news of no deal with Qatar.
The states reiterated that the actions of June the 5th came as a result of Qatar's failure of its obligation under international law and its continued interference in Arab states. The four states express regret about Qatar's negative response, which is a failure of them to understand the gravity of the situation.
Okay, the Egyptian Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry is speaking there. So, is Qatar entirely innocent of the charges it faces? What happens now that the deadline has been extended and expired again? And could all of this escalate even further? Well, here to discuss those questions and more, I'm joined by Ardavan Amir Aslani, who is a political analyst and a lawyer. Welcome back to France 24.
Thank you for having me.
To my right is Joe Macaron, who is a policy analyst. Welcome to you. And from Manchester, we're joined by Navana Mahmood, who is a doctor, writer and commentator on Middle Eastern issues. Thank you very much indeed to all of you for joining us. Let me start by turning to you, Joe. Doha saying the demands are impossible to meet. Are these demands, in your opinion, realistic or unrealistic?
I mean, it depends on which perspective. I mean, obviously, we are now in a stalemate, basically, in how the things are. There's no basically green light for the alliance of the four countries to basically run the table, and there's no even chance for Qatar to basically say completely no. We are in stalemate, basically. There's no enough international support to go each of those sides. And I think there's not, I mean, the problem is they are looking at it more as a GCC internal issue in Saudi Arabia, that Doha should be a part of the GCC consensus, not to be out of it. But obviously there's no way to settle this issue in the coming weeks. It's going to be the Saudi-led coalition is hoping to normalize those measures. At the same time, they are not stopping whether the Al-Udeid airbase, whether the flow supply route of the gas market. So basically, it's mostly turning into this coalition that's, frankly, it's distracting from other more important issues in the region, whether in Syria, what's happening, whether what's happening in Iraq against the ISIL. But the problem is, it's rooted, this problem, in the Arab Spring. It's a fallout of the Arab Spring. It's a fallout of the Trump administration coming to power. It's a fallout from the 2014 agreement that failed to reach a real mechanism to solve these issues. And now we are living in this post-Arab Spring where the two sides of this Arab Spring that fought in Egypt, fought a little bit in other countries, are trying to basically take this matter between each other. And I think, again, it's a distraction. It's going to be not only a week, it's going to take a while to get out of it. And because there's no really clear consensus, whether in Washington or the international community, to either solve or end this issue.
Let me turn to you, Ardavan. We didn't really hear any concrete measures did we come out of the leaders who gathered there in Cairo? I mean, there wasn't any sort of sense from the speeches we heard as to what they might do next. Where do you see things heading?
No, the incredible nature of this matter is astonishing. You know, accusations against Qatar on the grounds of supporting and financing terrorism coming from Saudi Arabia is the most obnoxious thing I have ever heard, as the Saudis themselves are considered by important members of the international community as the primary source of financing for terrorism. Let us not forget that the United States Congress, both houses, quasi unanimously voted to override Obama's veto, preventing victims of 9/11 from suing the Saudis and Saudi assets on the grounds of terrorism. 15 out of the 19 terrorists were Saudis. So the Saudis finger pointing the Qataris is quite astonishing. That being said, what Saudi Arabia and its allies want to achieve is basically to turn Qatar into a vassal of Saudi Arabia. They don't want Qatar to act as an independent sovereign state. And what are those 13 requests? Shut down your TV station? Pay damages to Saudi Arabia? On what grounds? Why to Saudi Arabia? Furthermore, cut down relations with Iran, as if you could cut it down any further, bearing in mind that Qatar does not even have an ambassador in Iran. This would entail the cutting off of the relations, which is basically impossible for Qatar in light of the common gas field that Qatar is sharing with Iran. So the Qataris didn't have any choice whatsoever, aside from declining to consent to what the Saudis were trying to dictate. It is a matter of their national sovereignty. And furthermore, the Saudis miscalculated one reality. They thought that they could barge down Qatar and impose their wishes on Qatar because Qatar would be isolated. This is not the case today, because as we saw, the cutting off of the land route from Saudi Arabia to Qatar prevented food products from entering the country. The next hour, jumbo cargo planes took off from Tehran, from Istanbul to Qatar, and provided all Qatar needed as far as its daily requirements were concerned. And Qatar today has the largest country in the area, one of the most powerful, Iran behind it, which has sided with Qatar, and furthermore, basing themselves on the accusation of support for the Muslim Brotherhood, because that is a philosophical issue behind it, as the Saudis and other petromonarchies of the Persian Gulf have a tendency to consider the Muslim Brotherhood as the exact existential threat that they wanted to avoid. They've brought in Turkey to the fight. And Turkey is the only Muslim country in the world that is being run by a quasi-member of the Muslim Brotherhood organization. So Qatar doesn't feel isolated. The Russians are out there. They're trying to play a moderate role now. But Qatar is in a position of strength. There are no dire consequences for Qatar as far as this quasi-embargo is concerned. Food is abundant. The oil and gas operations out of the South Pars field are ongoing. Furthermore, the port is fully operational. It's a $10 billion port that they inaugurated a year ago. The airlines that can no longer fly through Saudi and Egyptian airspace are using Iranian and Turkish airspace. So, reminding us of Shakespeare's famous play, it's much ado about nothing. And nothing's going to change anytime soon, because it's a matter of basically existence for Qatar. Qatar will not become, at least that's what we've heard so far, a vassal of Saudi Arabia. Qatar feels strong, and Qatar feels that it is legally founded to oppose what they perceive as a Saudi aggression. And honestly speaking, from a legal point of view, there are issues over here that one could dig into, such as, the quasi-embargo could be construed as an act of war. The right to prevent Qatari planes from flying over Saudi Arabian airspace is against the international convention ruling these kind of matters. The fact that they're trying to impose an embargo over the sea around Qatar is another act of war that may be construed. So they're stuck. Now what the Saudis are compelled to do is only to up the antes, which implies for them to use their usual arm, which is their wallet diplomacy, and basically threaten all the business partners of Qatar and tell them, if you want to do business with Saudi Arabia or the UAE or the other members of this anti-Qatari coalition, you can't do business with Qatar. But even in that specific case, it's going to be difficult because Qatar has other options.
Let me introduce our other guest in Manchester, Nirvana Mahmood. Let me just ask for your reaction, Nirvana. Do you share those views? Do you also view perhaps Qatar as being set up for failure by being given a set of demands that perhaps no nation on earth would be in a position to accept? What are your thoughts?
Right. I think it's important to see this crisis within the prism of the Gulf states. The GCC has always been a united front. Now Qatar is behaving slightly different than the policy of the GCC. So the core demand of the other countries is loyalty and trust. Ignore the other problems. The other problem is that they don't trust Qatar and they don't feel Qatar is loyal to them. Now, the other problem, I'm glad that you guys saying that Qatar is in a strong position. So now we should admit that Qatar is not sieged. It's not boycott. It's just boycotted, but not sieged. And that is the issue. So Qatar have nothing to complain about. And the press conference which come in Egypt have proven that they are not willing to have any military escalation and not doing anything more than the current situation, which is just a boycott. On the other hand, it's important to see that Qatar cannot claim that it doesn't support terrorism and then claim it is not the only country that supports terrorism. They have to decide where is their stance. If they are one of many bad countries in the region, or they are completely innocent. And if they are completely innocent, then they have to justify why they are supporting groups like Al-Nusra Front in Syria and why they support many radical groups in Libya. How they can see these groups as democratic or representative of the Arab Spring.
Okay, thanks for that. Let me just bring into the conversation Salman Al-Ansari, who is founder and president of the Saudi American Public Relations Affairs Committee, who joins us from Riyadh. Let me just ask you this. Just listening to what we've been hearing, that Qatar is actually managing to survive. It's not business as usual, but it's not a complete siege of the country. Do you think there's a risk that all of this could backfire on Saudi Arabia and the other three countries in that coalition confronting Qatar right now?
Hello, thank you so much, and hi to you, and hi to all the viewers of France 24 around the globe. I think nothing will backfire at Saudi or the other countries. For what reason? Because if we look at the context of the Riyadh summit, when more than 50 Muslim leaders met with the President of the United States, they've had like a very clear strategy on combating terrorism. And the strategy can be summarized, I can summarize it by one word, which is zero tolerance to all terrorist groups and terrorist advocates and terrorist supporters and sponsors. So I think it's right now more clear for all of us that we cannot tolerate the Qatari behavior by having this kind of duality to basically try to show that they are actually mediators, but they are actually sponsors of groups. And they are not shy of saying so. Let's look at what Jabhat al-Nusra, which is an Al-Qaeda affiliated group in Syria. They are the ones that actually disturbed the moderate opposition within Syria. And that was at the help and at the support of actually the Iranian and the Shah agendas. It's actually very fascinating to see how the Qatari were actually marketing for them through their media engine, advocating for terrorism, advocating for hatred. This should be stopped. It's the same thing with Libya. As you just had said, that the Qatari government has been actually supporting Fajr Libya militia. And this militia has been actually disturbing the peace in Libya and actually trying to exploit the region just for very dogmatic goals to spread the Muslim Brotherhood idea.
Okay.
It's the same thing. It's the same thing in Egypt. Let's look at Egypt. Like, let's see how many terrorist attacks happened against churches, against police officers and military personnel, and they were all advocated by the media engine of Jazeera, and also by and there are some reports that there are actually some intelligence cooperation between Qatar and with
okay, let me cut you off for a moment. Let me just cut you off for one moment because the audio quality isn't great. But let's just come back to the studio here and let me put this question to you, to Joe. We just heard from Mr. Al-Ansari there this idea that the countries that are currently opposing Qatar have a zero tolerance approach to extremist organizations. And yet a publication came out today in the United Kingdom from the Henry Jackson think tank, citing Saudi Arabia as being the #1 source of financing for extremist groups in the United Kingdom. There seems to be a lot of finger pointing going on right now.
I mean, obviously, yeah, the situation is very tense. The support funding for ISIL or other extremist group come from all GCC countries, unofficially mostly, and it goes through there. I mean, Al-Nusra was part of the coalition. They changed their name basically to make it sound more good, but they were part of the GCC alliance. I mean, you have the invasion of Yemen, which created more radicalism, and also it was outside the international community. I mean, we cannot finger point. Everybody is guilty in the GCC in that sense, in what happened in the Arab Spring. But the Saudis, I mean, specifically to point in that direction, I think it lacks some credibility and some objectivity in that sense. But the problem is, if we have this problem, how to solve it? Obviously, the international community doesn't buy into a lot of these talks because they didn't join in this blockade. So obviously, the thing is more complicated in that sense. The Libya and the Qatari were joined the international community. Then it gets complicated, and then you had both sides: Egyptians supporting Haftar and the Qatari supporting more the government in Tripoli. So my main concern is to look more in the big picture. My last point is the issue with the Saudi-led coalition is the same like Yemen. You get into a problem, you don't know how to get out of it. You put the ceiling so high that it's hard to get out of it. This is where we are now in the quagmire in Qatar. How to get out? The ceiling became so high that it's possible to retreat and try to solve it.
Okay, plenty for us to talk about in the second half. That's it for the first half of the France 24 debate. We'll be back in 2 minutes. Don't go away. Welcome back to the second half of the France 24 debate. Today we have our eyes focused firmly on events in Cairo, where the foreign ministers of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt and Bahrain have been gathering to discuss next steps with regard to the continuing standoff with Qatar. Doha was given a set of 13 demands, and following an extension, Qatar has formally rejected them, calling them all unreasonable. One of the demands was the closure of the Al Jazeera news channel. Let's listen to how the channel's managing director reacted.
We, as Al Jazeera employees, will continue to work with professionalism until the very last moment. I'm optimistic that we will overcome this crisis as we overcame previous crises, and I think the world will not allow for this interruption or this backwardness.
And that was the managing director speaking there about the demand that Al Jazeera be shut down. Let me turn to our guest in Manchester, Navana Mahmood. Navana, I don't know if you're a viewer of Al Jazeera, perhaps you're not, but what's your understanding of what Al Jazeera, specifically their Arabic language channel, is accused of having done?
Right. There is a big difference between Al Jazeera English and Al Jazeera Arabic, as you rightly mentioned. On Al Jazeera Arabic, it is claiming to represent openness, the other voices in the region, to represent a Western-style media in the Middle East, and a very professional media as well. However, in reality, it isn't. It is just as a propaganda machine, like all the other channels in the region. There were interviews. I published in my blog some nuggets of examples of why Al Jazeera Arabic is wrong. They allowed a researcher to pledge allegiance to ISIS live on TV. Then they interviewed him again. Several anchors of Al Jazeera have actually expressed sadness for the death of Amaq, producer, who is the media channel of ISIS. When he died, they said he was a good guy and he was a martyr. There was several interviews in Arabic with head of Al-Nusra Front, Julani, and not just interviewing him. They thanked him at the end and wished him to God bless him. That for me was shocking.
All right, so clearly some issues there related to extremist organizations. Let me just ask you, Ardavan, I mean, Al Jazeera has been a thorn in the side, hasn't it, of a number of governments in the region, because they're very quick to criticize neighboring countries, but not so quick to criticize themselves.
One of the fundamental problems that the Saudis are encountering with Qatar is that Qatar has decided to adopt an independent foreign policy. The Saudis have a tendency to consider that all of the other states on the Arabian Peninsula should be nothing but followers of the Saudi line. Now, what Qatar has done is that Qatar has adopted this independent foreign policy and has implemented tools enabling it to convey its independent policy. Now, I'm not aware of what was being said in relation to, or what is being said in the Arabic version of the Al Jazeera TV station, but I'm sure there have been discrepancies, but does that entail the entire condemnation of the entire news organization? I'm not certain. But this behavior is a consequence of Saudi's desire to impose absolute hegemony over the region. That's what they don't like with Qatar. They believe that Qatar is playing an outsized role. And when you push this story even further, the Saudi attitude versus Qatar is going to entail two huge consequences. Number one, it's going to be to put an end to the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, which had never as purpose the identification of a unique foreign policy by all of its member states, who are, after all, sovereign, independent entities. Its purpose was to basically create economic integration between its members. Now that is off the agenda, because on one side you have Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain, and on the other you have Qatar. You have Kuwait, who has not cut off its relations with Qatar, and the Sultanate of Oman. It's half-half now, and it's just basically going down the drain. And furthermore, when you dig into the story further, this attitude of the Saudis has basically backfired, because you've got on the other side of the Persian Gulf, this huge country that is Iran, that is enjoying the show. Saudis, by ostracizing Qatar, they have entailed the following consequence, putting Qatar into the hands of the Iranian state. And even worse, the accusation that the Saudis are professing against the Qataris for their defense and support of the Muslim Brotherhood means that they've even also pushed the Muslim Brotherhood into Iranian hands. And now imagine a Shia Persian country having a physical presence de facto through Qatar now on the Arabian Peninsula, and being considered as an ally, or at least because the enemies of my enemies are my friend, by the Muslim Brotherhood globally. Now, this entire policy has backfired. And furthermore, let us go back to this crisis that the Saudis have imposed. It is not because Qatar has identified alternative options enabling it to survive that there have been no consequences. When you look at the geography of Qatar, it only has one land connection, that's Saudi Arabia. And that's been cut off. You can no longer drive into Qatar, that's cut off. When they prevent you from flying over all of your neighboring countries, basically, and Saudi Arabia is the largest one by far, this has consequences. When your ships cannot take harbor in various ports, that has consequences. Now, the fact that Qatar has found alternative solutions and options to survive doesn't mean that the country has not suffered. And let us remember, and it was mentioned by the Qatari Foreign Affairs Minister, this region has connections. People are connected. The people of Qatar originally were from Saudi Arabia, from the mainland continent. Now there are thousands of families that have been cut off one from the other. Husband unable to reach wife. Children being expelled from Qatar because they are UAE citizens, because nationality follows that of the father. There are human tragedies going on.
Okay. So some consequences. It's not exactly business as usual. And let's just going back to this question of Al Jazeera. I'm not sure if you're a viewer of Al Jazeera, Joe, but do you feel like the brand has been permanently damaged now? Do you feel like there's always going to be a doubt in the minds of viewers that perhaps what they're watching, what they're hearing is not objective?
I mean, I'm one of those maybe few or not who believe there's nothing called Arab media. It's basically a reflection of the regime. What's happening now, if you look at the Arab media map, especially after the Arab Spring, you have the Saudi-funded and you have the Qatari-funded. This is basically the map. Otherwise, are just small. So basically, there's been a conflict between those two for a while. If you remember the 2014 agreement, there was a deal between the two countries. Suddenly, all Saudi official and expert became regular guests on Al Jazeera. Recently, the friction got more complicated because of Egypt. This was the main issue that basically exploded the relation. So Al Jazeera was the first media to start this Arab sensation of news channel. Then everybody joined. And now I think they can do better job in a lot of things, like other media. They are not a perfect media. And they reflect definitely the foreign policy of Qatar. But my concern is if we close the Qatari-funded Qatar, we have a domination of Saudi media in the Middle East. Then we have basically any debate between anyone. Because otherwise, nobody has money to fund like a secular, liberal, progressive media that we all can be happy to be part of. But this is not the case now. We have a very narrow. I mean, if you look at the Saudi media during this crisis, it has nothing as professional. It was just propaganda, similar like Qatar. But we have to offer the audience in the Middle East an alternative, a better. Now we don't have. But my concern is, if we shut down Qatar, we have only one voice in this region. And for me, this is a bit concerning.
Don't you think, let's just go back to Riyadh and speak to Salman Al-Ansari, don't you think that's a little bit unrealistic as a demand that Qatar shut down its internationally acclaimed news channel? Perhaps would do you think the Saudi-led coalition would accept some sort of a mea culpa from Qatar and say, okay, we admit we have made some mistakes, we're going to work on them, but not shut down the whole news channel, surely?
Yeah, let me tell you something. The ironic motto of Al Jazeera channel is a platform for the ones who do not have one. And it's actually true because they have been hosting Osama bin Laden's speeches, al-Zawahiri speeches, al-Zarqawi speeches. And it's the most credible source for all extremist individuals. So this is very, very dangerous. We cannot combat terrorism if we leave the ideological part. We should confront the ideological part at the same time while we are confronting it militarily. So, and the United States actually understood this very well. So that's why 2 years ago or a year and a half ago, they actually shut down Al Jazeera America in the United States, even though some people said it was like the decision of Al Jazeera.
Yeah, some disagreement here in the studio as to what the reasons were for that.
I know, I'm getting there. Al Jazeera America got shut down, and if you go to the report of the reasons behind that, because the United States, through the organizations and the free media cable networks, were pushing Al Jazeera America out of a lot of states, so they were not allowing a cable from Al Jazeera America to process it. Otherwise, it would not be shut down during just like a couple of years, like it was operating for a couple of years, and they spent more than $800 million just to open one channel. But they knew, the American government and the American political fabric, they knew the danger.
If I may just barge in.
Go ahead.
If I may just jump in, just to follow up on what was being said. Thank you very much. And the comment of Mr. Macron was very clear. There is no independent media worthy of this name in the entire region. But I can recall, in relation to this finger pointing of who you're a terrorist and who's not a terrorist, John Kerry in Jeddah telling the Saudis, ISIS is not just about, 55,000 bearded Kalashnikov-carrying people. By the way, according to the Iraqi Prime Minister, 40% of whom are Saudi nationals, talking about terrorism. It's an ideology. So even if you manage to overthrow and annihilate ISIS, you won't be able to kill ISIS. It will pop up elsewhere. And the only way to finish off ISIS is to finish off the financing and the ideology, vehicles for communicating, conveying the thoughts behind it. And he specifically mentioned Al Arabiya, Arabic channel, which is a Saudi version of Al Jazeera, as one of the major icons for conveying that kind of thought process, encouraging terrorism. And this finger pointing is just the pot mocking the kettle. It's ongoing, and it's not going to get anyone anywhere. At the end of the day, the only thing that will work out and the only thing that will end the story is when ideology, Islamic fundamentalist Wahhabi ideology, coming from Saudi Arabia, will not be conveyed abroad, broadcasted over all these channels, and source of financing will stop. And where does the financing come from? The Saudis say it's not the state, but they acknowledge it comes from their civil society.
Okay, how do you respond to that, Mr. Al-Ansari? Go ahead, please.
Okay, here's the thing. These flashy words can get us nowhere. Why? Because the facts say the following. Where does ISIS officially operate? It's in Iraq, Syria, and Libya. Guess what? None of these three countries ever allowed Saudi-funded mosques or madrasas or schools in the past.
That is not correct for Syria. No, it's not correct.
It's completely correct.
This is not correct. As you may recall, before Assad cut off its relations, they opened up the doors to Saudis. They went in, changed the mosque, and funded.
Let's listen to Mr. Al-Ansari. Let him finish.
Let's have a civil dialogue. Let's have a civil dialogue where everyone has his right to speak. So what I'm trying to say is, it's very trendy at this time to just basically blame Saudi for terrorist ideology, etc. This is completely nonsense. Let me tell you
nonsense and you talk about civility?
Let me speak about. Don't interrupt me, brother. Don't interrupt me. So what I'm trying to say is, Saudi Arabia has been attacked 30 times, 30, last year, just like here, by ISIS, in Mecca, in Medina, in all those places. So if you go and give any kind of hint that Saudi is on the same page with ISIS and Al-Qaeda, this is absurd, complete absurdity. So nobody can get this if they do their homework and studying the case. So combating terrorism, as I said, is a global responsibility, and the regional parties, specifically the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Egypt and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, are trying to go hand by hand with the United States and the global community to confront the ideology that feeds terrorism. And unfortunately, Iran and Qatar have been the major problem makers in the region, and that's why we need to confront them with decisiveness.
Okay.
This is Saudi finger pointing.
Okay, just have one more word on that, and I just want to move on very, very briefly onto another topic. Your response to his comments there.
No, in relation to Assad, we should not forget that before this entire story opened up in Syria and wreaked havoc in that country, Syria, Assad, and the Saudis were very close. Abdullah had a very close relationship, previous king of Saudi Arabia, with Assad. And the problems began specifically when the Saudi funding for Syrian mosques began. When you look at countries such as Pakistan that have been influenced by Saudi ideology, what happened to Pakistan, which was a country of tolerant Islam, of mausoleums, of Sufism? The Saudi money went in, created madrasas, created Salafi Wahhabi ideology, and basically transformed that moderate country into what it has become now, an Al-Qaeda stronghold.
Let me bring back into the conversation Nirvana Mahmood in Manchester. I mean, what we've been talking about here is there have been some changes on the landscape in the region. There's new leadership in Saudi Arabia vis-a-vis a few years ago. There's been some recent reshuffling of the senior positions in the Saudi leadership. We have a new president, of course, in the White House. Is any of this a factor in your view? Are you able to join the dots and help us understand if perhaps these have been key factors in the situation we find ourselves in right now?
Right. For me, I think what I heard up to now is what is bad about Saudi Arabia, not what is good about Qatar. And that, for me, is a problem, is that nobody is disputing all what is mentioned about Saudi Arabia. I am not here to defend Saudi Arabia. I can see some optimism and hope that the new leadership in Saudi Arabia will change track and will try to improve the bad record of the past. But the problem today is whether Qatar is on the right side of the history or not. Qatar have a different style of sponsoring terrorism than Saudi Arabia. What at least I see Saudi Arabia as more obvious, more clear, while Qatar is playing the gray zone. And for me, that is more alarming because it tricks many youths of joining what they believe they are good groups, right groups, fighting Assad, fighting for democracy in Libya. And that for me is more alarming. I hope the future is the West and all the liberal supporters of democracy in the Middle East try to at least acknowledge that both sides are guilty and trying to hope that both sides are trying to learn from the past and formulate a formula which is better for the future. I don't want to close channels. Okay. I want channels to stop propaganda. I don't want to pinpoint blames between pots and kettles. I want both sides to acknowledge they made mistakes. I don't want to see the GCC collapse. I want to see unity. I don't want them to support Turkey and Iran and trying to turn against their own neighbors. That's what should be the agenda for the future.
Okay, so how would we get out of this impasse that we're in right now, Joe?
I just want to answer your question. I think the biggest shift of this crisis, because it almost happened in 2014, Obama intervened and said, let's get the act together and focus on ISIS. This presidency, this US presidency, basically had a very ambiguous position. You have now more the White House on one side and the State Department and the Pentagon on one side, basically confusing everybody. What happened and what allowed the crisis now to be a little bit contained is the calls by Trump to Turkey. Egypt today, what they were meeting, asked for everybody to contain, but focus on the issue, focus on terrorism. Basically, what Trump or the White House is allowing is the crisis to be de-escalated, but not to be solved immediately until we have a real negotiation. The problem is how to be moved now from this stalemate, where nobody is recognizing the other to talk, to get to this point. The Kuwaitis were able to de-escalate. The Qatari Emir were ready to make a speech. They Kuwaiti asked him to stop a few weeks ago. Now the Saudis didn't escalate immediately after the 48 hours. So obviously there's some talk going on. But I think the attitude should change on both sides a little bit. The Americans should be more clear. Trump is basically letting Tillerson basically struggle by himself and not giving real clarity on where things stand. And this should not be from the White House, because historically, the GCC, the stability part of the U.S. in the GCC was crucial. Now you have a big shift where the U.S. is not seen as anymore as the stability factor. And again, for me, I see this issue as a distraction. It's going to be resolved eventually, but the people who are on both sides are going to pay the price meanwhile, and it's a distraction for what's happening in Syria and Iraq and in other places where the real issues are, not an inside family ruling feud that I think is, again, distracting from the real issues.
Okay, a family feud. What are your thoughts?
You know, talking about how this could come to an end. I'm quite fearful of the consequences that may pop up. It may remain within economic constraints, but it could go beyond that. We should remember that Saudi Arabia, a couple of years back, at the onset of the Arab Spring, despite the presence of the United States Sixth Fleet in Bahrain, sent its troops over the causeway and annihilated a popular revolt for democracy in a bloodbath, the famous Pearl Square riots. Saudi Arabia, because it's in disagreement with what's going on in Yemen, has sent its air force, killing 37,000 civilians in Yemen. Outbreak of the cholera disease, and worse, in the poorest Arab nation ever, the worst hunger crisis on the planet. All of these have been done in the past by the country that is the predominant force behind the Qatari story. So it may actually go sour, and that's what should be avoided. The problem, as it was very rightly mentioned by Mr. Macaroon, is that out of DC, two contradictory voices come out. You've got the president who tweets everything about Saudi Arabia is positive, and he's fully backing the Saudi position. His foreign minister is more reflecting a more nuanced, intelligent point of view, more in line with that of the president of France, for example. So the absence of a coherent policy coming out of DC basically convinces both parties, both the Saudis and the Qataris, they're on the right side of the story and that they will prevail because they're not getting any coherent messages coming out of America. Now, Europe needs to intervene in this story.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it will become a dangerous fight between the Wahhabi Salafi movement, the Muslim Brotherhood, and God knows what's going to happen in the country.
Yeah, in terms of filling the void then, in terms of breaking this impasse, let me just ask you, Navan, I mean, clearly, if the United States is confusing everybody with this rather duplicitous, two-faced approach to the situation, is it down to Europe? Is Europe the only solution, perhaps, to finding a break to this the situation we're in right now?
I believe that it is down to the Gulf states, because even if Europe will intentional imbalance, until all the players in the Gulf start to realize that they have to solve this problem among themselves, no other outside player can force a settlement. Let's just remind viewers that even when the Saudis send their troops to Bahrain, Qatar have actually supported that. But now they are playing to be on the side of the democracy. So it's important to understand all players, to know their own limitation. What I see in the Gulf is that small states have more ambitions than abilities. And that actually starts to ruin all the other Arab countries. I hope this crisis ends by every country in the region to know its own limitation. All of them, from Saudi Arabia to United Arab Emirates to Qatar, no, they cannot go any further. Okay. Any escalation should end, but chronicity, I fear the chronicity that will start to affect a lot of people.
Let me put this question to all of you. I mean, why doesn't Qatar, if it's innocent, and Qatar has been presented with this set of 13 demands, why doesn't Qatar issue a set of demands of its own? Why is it just sitting there saying we can't submit to these demands? Why don't
It has issued its demands. Its demands are very simple. Remove the embargo.
Yeah, but why
Remove
not, if we're accusing as well Saudi Arabia of financing terror groups, why not issue a demand that they shut down Al Arabiya, for example?
No, you see, because they want to play by the rules. At least that's what they're saying. They are playing the law, they're playing international rules, and they believe that a country should not be able to dictate the behavior in a domestic point of view of other nations. They are saying if there is anything wrong, create an independent international commission and for it to come and do the audit. Because they want to prove this, the Saudis have ruined Qatar's reputation, ruined Qatar's image. They are asking, as a matter of fact, for an independent organization to go in and check that all of the accusations of Saudi Arabia are fallacious. But at the end of the day, there is no way that you can, have your counterclaims against the others because you're too small. Qatar, we talk about Qatar and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is 28 million people strong. Half of them are foreign immigrant workers, but the other half are still Saudis. Qataris, there are 300,000 nationals. And they're Wahhabis, so the women don't count much. So the remainder that's out there is 150,000. You remove the elderly and you remove the young people, this leaves you 50,000 people who are actually operational in Qatar. So what do you expect the Qataris to ask the Saudis, the largest dominant country on the Arabian Peninsula, that is 100 times bigger? Nothing. And in front of one obnoxious request, the answer should not be another obnoxious request in return.
Okay, well, how about this as an approach? If European powers agree that Qatar is not completely innocent, but it's not alone, how about we isolate the whole region until they work this out for themselves?
This could be self-damaging because you have UK depend on Qatari gas, you have a lot of European countries that depend on the gas market. The US is less dependent on the energy market than the Middle East. This is why it's fine with Trump. There's no alarm clock and alarm bell in Washington that the U.S. gas market might get impacted. So the U.S. is more relaxed. But I know it's mostly a GCC issue, but both GCC sides want the U.S. guarantee for that. The Europeans, even if they intervene, they can help. They can try, the Germans can try, the French can try, but eventually they all look for the U.S. basically for a push. If Trump push one way or the other, this can be solved. But the UK are more vulnerable, the European, because they have the Russian gas on one end. It's more complicated. They are opening up to Iran and the economy. So the European is more nuanced because they understand the market. They understand geopolitics more, are more impacted by it. But the Kuwait can basically seal the deal. They are the elderly, the Emir of Kuwait, the elderly between the Emir and the Sheikh there. He is trusted by both sides. But then you have shift inside the Saudi family now, and then you have the Trump view. So they need the U.S. to come in to do the leadership role. Otherwise, it's not going to be solved.
Okay, Joe Macaron, you've had the last word. Thank you very much indeed to you for your contribution. Thank you also to Arvan Amir Aslani.
You invited me.
Thank you so much. And thank you to our guests outside the studio. Nivara Mahmoud, thank you very much indeed to you for joining us from Manchester. And thank you for joining us from Riyadh, Salman Al-Ansari. And we apologize against you for not including you too much in the conversation, but the audio quality dictated that to us. Thank you so much. Do stay tuned to France 24.